pouvoir commencer la séance d'aujourd'hui. Bienvenue à tous dans la salle et à distance pour cette nouvelle conférence du cycle L'araméen dans tous ses états. Vous allez aujourd'hui découvrir d'autres formes d'araméen qui sont les araméens juifs de la période de l'Antiquité tardive. Et je remercie vivement Geoffrey Herman d'avoir accepté de faire cette présentation. Geoffrey Herman est directeur d'études à l'école pratique des hautes études et il est spécialiste en particulier du judaïsme dans l'Empire sassanide, mais il a également publié sur le christianisme syriaque dans l'Empire sassanide. Donc je vous renvoie à sa bibliographie que vous pouvez trouver sur le site de l'EPHE. Et sans plus attendre, je vais lui laisser la parole pour l'intervention d'aujourd'hui. Donc Geoffrey, merci beaucoup d'avoir accepté cette tâche. Voilà. La parole est à toi.
Okay, merci beaucoup. I'm speaking in English. Thank you very much, Muriel, for inviting me to participate in this series. The Aramaic that we'll be looking at is the Aramaic of the Jews of late antiquity in the land of Israel and in Babylonia. We'll be looking at the literature and some of the sources and some of the features of this language. Now, although Aramaic has played a central role in Jewish heritage, it arrived as a latecomer after Hebrew. The two languages are related and they are close. And throughout the period in consideration today, they served alongside one another among the Jews in a natural relationship that could at times be complex, and they exhibited mutual influences on one another. You've recently heard lectures on biblical and Qumran Aramaic. The relationship between Aramaic and Hebrew in the biblical period is interesting. We can distinguish between what went on before and after the destruction of the first temple. Before, Aramaic is not understood by the Israelites, generally speaking, and the biblical literature in this period includes only a few words in Aramaic. After the return from Babylonian exile, we find many Aramaic texts in the Bible, such as in Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, and we witness a far greater impact of Aramaic on Hebrew. When we turn to the early rabbinic literature and Jewish sources prior to the 3rd century CE, called the Tannaitic literature, the Jews employed almost exclusively Hebrew in their religious works, but Aramaic is in widespread use among the Jews and is occasionally cited in the rabbinic works. For example, although the Code of Jewish Law, the Mishnah, is a Hebrew work, it cites legal documents in the Aramaic form. And here is an example from the tractate called Ketubot that deals with marriage contracts. And we have here the text. What is in black is in Hebrew and what is in red is in Aramaic. Si le mari n'a pas écrit au contrat, les enfants mâles que tu auras de moi hériteront, etc., etc. The citations are in Aramaic within the text that is Hebrew. Evidently, this literary text reflected actual use. As we can see, for example, in certain documents discovered from the Dead Sea documents, such as this one here, from the year 117 CE, which we have here in a French translation. I won't read the document, but what we see here is a document of marriage between Jews from the 2nd century, written in Aramaic, that was discovered in situ. The Aramaic in these documents is often referred to as Middle Aramaic, reflecting the Aramaic of the period between 200 BCE and 200 CE. Let's move on to late antiquity. The Palestinian Jewish Aramaic, also called Galilean Jewish Aramaic, is the Western dialect of Middle Aramaic, spoken and written by the Jews in the land of Israel from the 3rd century until roughly the Arab conquest. It is mostly attested in the rabbinic literature of late antiquity, composed for the most part in the Galilee. Here we have an example of the kind of the rabbinic works that are written in Galilean Jewish Aramaic. These works reflect the period from the 3rd to the 6th century. We have the Jerusalem Talmud, which is a book of law, and we have these midrashic works, which are exegetical commentaries on books of the Bible, of Genesis and Leviticus and Lamentations, the Song of Songs. Pesik to the Rav Kahana is a work that provides homilies on the major festivals, and there are other works too. So these works were written predominantly in the Galilean Aramaic dialect of the Jews of this period. They mix a lot of Hebrew, but it's not a random mix. Sources that are written originally in Hebrew are quoted in Hebrew within the work, but the predominant language is Aramaic here. Other compositions using this dialect include the Targums of the Hebrew Bible that we'll look at in a minute. There are synagogue inscriptions, and there's also non-liturgical poetry, much of which was rediscovered from the Cairo Geniza. And this language reflects much of the Greco-Roman impact on the inhabitants in the period, because we have a lot of Greek loans in the language. And we'll see all this in a moment. The script is the same as Hebrew in this period, and it reveals a lot of affinity with Hebrew. Let's take a look at one example, a short story, which is from Genesis Rabba. The story tells of a rabbi who goes to hide in a cave, and then he comes out and comes out after being in the cave for a long time. And the story begins, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai et son fils vécurent cachés dans une grotte pendant 13 ans, ne se nourrissant que de graines de caoube. Ils furent couverts de croûte sur tout le corps. So until this point, it's been in Hebrew. From now on, we now have the story continuing in Aramaic. Au terme de la 13e année, Rabbi Shimon, on s'assit à l'entrée de la grotte. Il vit un oiseleur qui chassait des oiseaux. Quand il entendait au ciel proclamer démission, l'oiseau s'échappait. Spécula, l'oiseau était capturé. Il se dit alors, si l'oiseau ne peut être capturé sans l'assentiment du ciel, encore moins un homme. Il sortit de la grotte et constata que les choses s'étaient apaisées. Il se rendit au terme de Beth Mekar et guérir. Son fils lui dit, cette vie nous a fait tant de bien. Est-ce que nous ne le nettoyerons pas de ces mots? Que fit-il? Il prit des lupins et les découpa pour en semer des bouts dans la roue. And it continues. Now, what I would like to point out here is the account is in Aramaic, yet certain words appear in Latin or in Greek. The terms for the bird being declared liberated or condemned are the words taken from the Roman court, dimissus, speculator. The term for the public bath, we have the word banaion, which is a loan word. But there are additional elements within the story which are hinted at, but not said. For example, dimissus sounds very much like demotion, the word for a public bath in Greek. So the audience of this story would have heard this and would have recognized the allusion, because the story takes place after the beginning in the public bath. The lupin here, the word for lupin in the language of the time is thermosin, which is the same Latin word, the same Greek word thermos. So again, an allusion to the public bath. So we have these allusions that the audience would appreciate because of the world they live in and the languages that they understand. And so this is something from this story. There is also epigraphic evidence. This in the Aramaic, Palestinian Jewish Aramaic dialect, often in synagogues. And I'm going to show you here two examples. The first one remembered for good, be the memory for good of the entire holy community, the great and the small ones, who were aided by the Lord of the world and who donated and made this mosaic. May the one who knows their names and those of their children and of their households inscribe them in the book of life together with the righteous, the members of all Israel, peace. Amen. Selah. So we have here a statement, a declaration for the community for their donation to the community. The mosaic maker saved time without needing to mention all the names of the contributors. But it's interesting because this is a synagogue, which is really the domain of Hebrew in this time. The liturgy is in Hebrew, and yet this seems to echo a prayer in Aramaic. It's actually a prayer that's still recited in Aramaic today in synagogues. And so that's the first source here. Now this second one, Menier soit la mémoire de Pinchas le prêtre, fils de Justa, qui a donné le prix de la mosaïque et de mortier de ses propres deniers. It's a very short inscription, but the words that I've highlighted here in the Aramaic, time psiphas. We have here Greek loanwords within the inscription employed in a very natural way in this inscription. Both of these inscriptions come from the region of Jericho in the south. So this Aramaic is not just being used in the Galilee, but it is throughout the land of Israel at the time. Now, among the characteristics of Galilean Jewish Aramaic in this period was the weakening of the distinctions between the guttural consonants. Presumably under the impact of Greek and perhaps other developments, we find this phenomenon expressed in a rabbinic anecdote, actually preserved in the Babylonian Talmud. And this is about how this phenomenon was seen from the outside. So let's take a look at this story here. There was a Galilean who would go about saying, "Who has an Amma?" And they said to him, "Oh, foolish Galilean, what do you mean? Do you mean Hama, a donkey on which to ride on, or do you mean Hama, wine to drink, or Amma, wool to wear, or Ima, a lamb to be slaughtered?" And we can see here that this text very clearly distinguishes between four different words which have become homonyms to the Galilean, and the vulgarities of his speech reveal this. But this was not just in theory. When we see, for example, this delightful mosaic from a synagogue from the same period, we have this lovely inscription, "May the artisan who made this work be remembered for good." The thing is that his spelling reveals that he doesn't distinguish between the certain sounds. And so instead of saying, as you can see by what I've emphasized here, the avad chada avedata, who made this work, is actually, it should be hada with a hey. And he doesn't know the difference between a hey and a het. So he doesn't distinguish between them. But far more serious is the last word, avedata. Now, avedata means a loss. It doesn't mean a work. Avedata, with the way it should have been spelled, would be with an ayin, but it's spelled with an aleph. And so he's not going to be remembered for good. He's going to be remembered for being for not distinguishing between the gutturals the way one would have hoped. So that is the case that we have here. Now, another major source of material in this dialect is the Aramaic translations of the Bible called Targum. When the Torah was recited in synagogue, it was translated verse by verse on Sabbaths and festivals, probably, and this was a custom that was practiced in antiquity. So we have here five different Targums that have reached us today. Onkelos, Pseudo-Jonathan, the Fragment Targum, fragments of Palestinian Targum, and Targum Neophyte. So they aren't all in the Palestinian Jewish dialect. The Onkelos is more complicated, but the others are. let me just say something about these. Targum Onkelos is very literal. It remains close to the text, but the version we have was clearly revised in Babylonia. And in fact, at the same time, it exhibits features of an earlier Aramaic, the Aramaic that was before the Galilean dialect. The strange thing is that it was known in Babylonia, and in the Babylonian Talmud, they quote from it. Yet, nevertheless, it hasn't reached us in another form. The other versions, the Neophyte version, the Targum fragments, these were only discovered within the last century from the caractérise. We uncovered an enormous amount of material revealing a much wider productivity of Targum texts that we knew of before. The Neophyte was found in the Vatican. It's also an ancient text. Now, one of the characteristics of some of these Targums is the tendency to include midrashic expansions. They aren't just translating, they're also explaining, interpreting, and doing much more than the translation. So some of these texts translate literally, and some of them expand. Let me show you a couple of examples of this tendency. So Onkelos, I mentioned, is rather literal. So we have here an example of a verse from Exodus. Moïse lui dit, quand je sortirai de la ville, je lèverai mes mains vers l'Éternel. The translation simply repeats this, translates it literally, except it adds the word en prière. It needs to explain what is not clear to the audience, which is raising my hands is Hebrew idiom for praying. And so therefore it's explaining, very minimal, but not saying much more than that. So now we have another example of a translation where it is quite different. So we have a biblical verse. Vous ne vous ferez prendre d'idole, vous ne vous élevez ni l'image taillée ni statue, vous ne placerez dans votre pays aucune pierre ornée de figure pour vous prosterner devant elle, car je suis l'Éternel, votre Dieu. So the translation here has a lot to say about this. Vous ne poserez pas de pierres figuratives dans votre pays à des fins de prosternation, mais vous pourrez placer une stoa imprimée dans le sol de vos sanctuaires sans toutefois vous prosterner devant elle. In other words, you have to imagine the situation. The person reads this verse, and everybody is standing in the synagogue. The floor is filled with ornate images, such as these, that have been found. And the translator clarifies what the prohibition is for them in their days. It is not the prohibition of anything color, any image. No, it is an image which is intended for worship. It is an image that is raised above the ground, etc., etc. So we have a very, very clear intervention in the text of the Targum in order to bring it up to date, with contemporary issues of that time. The Jews in the land of Israel lived in a multilingual reality. There were other languages about them, and one interesting source that we encounter is in the Jerusalem Talmud. It's a taxonomy of languages. 4 languages are worthy of being used in the world, and these are Greek for song, Latin for battle, Aramaic for eulogies, and Hebrew for speech. Well, one doesn't need much imagination to understand why Latin is for battle, because the Romans are the ones with the Latin, and Greek was, I suppose, very widespread among in the country, and Hebrew perhaps one can leaves many options open. Aramaic for eulogies is a little bit puzzling, because when you look into the Babylonian Talmud and you look for eulogies, there are many, and they're all in Hebrew, and they're in a beautiful Hebrew, and none of them are in Aramaic. And so this would be a little bit of a surprise. However, again, the caractérise has provided us with a host of poetry written in this dialect in Jewish Aramaic from Palestine. And we can see the publication with the English translation, and the Hebrew publication. In the center, you see an image of the caractérise, as it was as it arrived in Cambridge University, and so here we have a collection of poems, non-liturgical poems written in the vernacular Aramaic of the period that had not been known about before, and these provide us with a whole host of creativity in this in the Aramaic of the time. Here's an example. It's a little bit small, perhaps. I'll just read the one or two lines. It's definitely a eulogy. It's for a young person who's passed away. Be comforted, O mourners, in each generation. Then you shall be akin to the righteous. Banish your tears and dry your eyes. Justify God's decree against you like the faithful ones. So, so this is the kind of poem. There are many dozens of others that were found and were preserved and copied for centuries and reached the Cairo Geniza. Another dialect of Aramaic that I'll mention in passing, I think it's not to be covered elsewhere, is the Samaritan Aramaic. And it's interesting, it belongs in the same region in Samaria, the region of Nablus, Shechem. And in late antiquity, it was the language spoken by the Samaritans in this period. And the language, we have works, a number of works in this language. The Targum to the Pentateuch is perhaps the oldest in Samaritan Aramaic to have survived. Unlike many of the Jewish counterparts, it's very literal. It sticks to the text. It doesn't expand. It's dated to the 3rd century. There's a midrashic work called Tibat Marke, midrash, much of it on the book of Exodus. And then there's liturgical poetry by poets called Marke, Nina, and Amram Dare. And we have finally a chronicle called the Book of Asatir that has survived as well. And it's somewhat influenced by Arabic, this last work. Among the basic features of Samaritan Aramaic is the much stronger evidence of the erosion of the guttural letters. They seem to be almost randomly placed. The fusion of the bilabial consonant W with the labiodental V, and the impact of biblical Hebrew. This is biblical Hebrew as spoken by the Samaritans, which is different than the biblical Hebrew that was pronounced by the Jews in this period. Now the script, we can see the script here is not the same script as used by the Jews in this period. It's called Paleo-Hebrew. It's Paleo-Hebrew script. It was preserved by them for their language. What you see here in this 3 columns is actually 3 different languages. The right column is the Hebrew Bible. The middle column is the Aramaic translation, the Samaritan Aramaic translation, and the left column is the translation into Arabic, but still using the same letters of the alphabet. So that's Samaritan Aramaic. Let's move now to the Babylonian Jewish Aramaic. And this is an Eastern dialect of Middle Aramaic, and it's spoken by the Jews in Babylonia. It's attested from the 3rd until the 11th centuries CE. It's found in 3 kinds of sources. The Babylonian Talmud, incantation bowls found in Iraq from late antiquity, and the literature written by the rabbis in Iraq from the beginning of the Islamic era until around the 11th century. The heads of the rabbinic academies in Iraq were called Geonim, and this is called Geonic Aramaic. These are the predominant types that we find. As you can see here, well, we'll see in a minute, it's written in the same Hebrew script like the Hebrew in the period, and it too exhibits the impact of Hebrew. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is written in a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic, and it may seem at times that the languages are actually mixed together, but this is not the case. There's a very clear distinction between the use of language in the Talmud, and it's based on function. Aramaic functions as a language of scholastic discourse and debate. The technical terms appear in Aramaic, and it's the cement that holds everything together. And it's also the language of numerous narratives composed within this period that appear. And the Hebrew, on the other hand, is employed for legal rulings and statements, and of course for the citation of earlier sources that were in any case in Hebrew. So how different was the Eastern dialect and the Western dialect of Jewish Aramaic? The languages were perhaps not so different, and one imagines that one could understand another person who was speaking the alternative dialect. But the Bavli thematizes this question in a very amusing story as follows. Une fois un Babylonien est venu en terre d'Israël. Il a épousé une femme. Il lui dit, fais bouillir pour moi 2 sabots, tu l'as fait. Elle a fait bouillir 2 lentilles, tu l'as fait. Il était en colère contre elle. Le lendemain, il lui dit, faites bouillir pour moi un coup grive. Elle a bouilli pour lui en mesure de grain, grive. Il lui dit, apportez-moi 2 citrouilles pour ce dîner. Il lui a apporté 2 lampes chiragées. Il lui dit, brisez-les sur la tête de la porte. And porte is Baba. Baba, fils de Boutin, était à la porte, en train de trancher une affaire judiciaire. Il est allé et brisé sur sa tête. Il lui demanda pourquoi fais-tu ça. Elle a répondu, mon mari m'a dit de faire ça. Il lui dit, tu as exécuté la volonté de son mari, que Dieu te donne 2 filles comme Baba ben Bouta. So this story is delightful. It has 4 misunderstandings of vocabulary based, as it would claim, on misunderstandings between the Galilean Jewish dialect and the Babylonian Jewish dialect. And if we look at the 4 examples, we see the following. Sabot is talafeh, lentille is talafheh. Coup is griva, mesure de grain is griva. Citrouille, the one word, lamps, shirage. So we have these 2 words, and la porte is Baba, and in the Babylonian town, for the Babylonians, Baba ben Muta is the name. Oh, sorry, it's the other way around. In the Babylonian dialect, Baba is a door, and Baba is the name for the Palestinians. The thing about this story is that it was told in the Babylonian Talmud, and so the audience would not have understood the Galilean dialect. They could only understand the story if it spoke in the vocabulary that they knew already. And so we see here words, for example, words that are actually homonyms in Babylonia. And so for the Babylonians, it's funny. Griva, which is a loan word from Middle Persian, has 2 different meanings within the language, and so therefore they can make the joke. And there's some other examples within this which I won't stay with, but nevertheless, so we have here the notion that there were different vocabulary understandings within the 2 languages, but not necessarily the ones exactly in this story. Nevertheless, one of the most important advances in scholarship in recent decades has been the actual preparation of separate dictionaries for the 2 dialects of Jewish Aramaic in late antiquity by Michael Sokolov of Bar-Ilan University, one for the Jewish Palestinian Aramaic and another for the Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, and they reveal very, very clearly the subtle differences and the larger differences between the 2 dialects that one can follow within these dictionaries. Now, while Aramaic was the vernacular for the Jews in Babylonia, it had a prestige problem. This is expressed in the Babylonian Talmud. It's pitted against other languages. And so, for example, let's take a look at this source. Rabbi Judah I said, in the land of Israel, why use the Syrian tongue? One should use either the holy tongue, Hebrew, or Greek. And Rav Yosef said, in Babylonia, why use Aramaic? One should use either the holy tongue or Persian. So we have here a declaration criticizing the use of Aramaic, both in Palestine and in Babylonia, in favor of these considered to be these languages that were considered to be the higher languages. Now, the holy tongue was a literary language in this period. It wasn't a popular language. It was very widely known among scholars, but it wasn't widely known in general in both countries. And so the statement should not be taken as a genuine call for action, but maybe just an expression of preference within these languages. So that's a statement of preferences. But Aramaic also had another challenge, which was perhaps it was guilty of its success. And so it was a threat to Hebrew. And Hebrew was the language of sacredness, of prayer, of the synagogue. And nevertheless, many people, it would seem, were comfortable to pray in Aramaic. And so we have against this tendency that we can only imagine a statement in the Babylonian Talmud that Rav Judah said one should never ask for one's needs in Aramaic, pray in Aramaic. And Rabbi Yochanan said, whoever makes personal requests in Aramaic, the ministering angels pay no attention, since the angels did not understand Aramaic. So it's important, these are important things to know. So what we see here is that in both cases, the previous source that I read, it was cited by Judah the first. He's one of the top rabbis of the land of Israel. And here Rabbi Yochanan, who is quoted as saying what he says about angels, is also one of the top rabbis of the land of Israel. But these sources are only quoted in the Babylonian Talmud. It would seem that the Babylonian Talmud has the issue, and it wants to make its point by attributing a certain ideology to a high authority, the great rabbis of the land of Israel. And so therefore that is how it counters Aramaic in its own way. Babylonian Jewish Aramaic evolved, and many of the same phenomena that we saw with the other dialects were found here. Among the certain distinctive features, we have spelling, denoting the final vowel with an aleph and never with a hey. The emphatic state has become obscured in contrast to earlier forms. So there's no way to distinguish, for example, between a dream and the dream. They're both in this Babylonian dialect. They're both chelma, and there's no alternative. The gutturals weaken, and the loss of the final consonants. Now, the texts that we have, the Babylonian Talmud texts that we have, are redacted by schools and by learned redactors, and often they reflect the orthography of these sages who knew how things should be spelt, and so they would often not reflect exactly the way things were spoken and pronounced by people in the real, by contemporaries. But sometimes we can identify such features of how the language was actually spoken against how it appears in the manuscripts by looking at earlier manuscripts, by looking at certain earlier manuscripts that preserve the earlier forms of the language. And many of these were found in the caractérise. And so if we take a look at the source that we just read before, about the Galilean, the foolish Galilean. And so here we have a manuscript from the caractérise, and it copies the same source that we saw before. This is the same Galilean who would go about saying, who has... Now, he doesn't say Amai, he says Ema. And they say to him, you foolish Galilean, Ema, a donkey or upon which to ride, or Ema, a wine to drink, or Ema, wool to wear, or Ema, a lamb to be slaughtered. And what has happened here? The copyist, the Babylonian copyist, has blurred a whole series of distinctions that were preserved in the other version of the story because of the way they spoke, the way the real Babylonians actually spoke. So we have here a couple of issues here. The last letter of the verb azal, to go, has dropped off, and that's very common for the in this dialect. So if you look here, it says azeh, would go, instead of azel. It's dropped off. And then the resh has fallen off completely. Amar is to say, but there's no resh. And all these words that end with a resh end here with an aleph. And so there's no distinction between them. They're all Ema now. And this is a striking example of, we can see who gets the last laugh here. It's the what's called the pot calling the kettle black. The Babylonian copyist here is poking fun at the Galilean dialect, but in fact it is the Babylonian dialect that has been losing all these letters in the way they pronounce words. Let's move on now to the incantation bowls. This is a major resource for Babylonian Jewish Aramaic. These are simple clay magical personalized objects. Bowls with a text written in the center, usually spiraling out from the center of the bowl in concentric circles. They were typically commissioned by a magic expert, and who wrote each one individually, often for healing or protection from demonic harm or sustenance. The clients are named, and some bowls are actually dated, and they're dated to the 6th or the 7th centuries of the Common Era. Now, there's much that is formulaic, meaning repetition, but nevertheless, there's also a lot of text that's unique. And all signs point to placing these objects in roughly the 4th to the 7th centuries CE. The quality of the texts varied. Some are written by professional scribes and others not. And many have been found in archaeological excavations, and others have been sold on the black market, and they have reached us by that way. There are also other bowls written in other Aramaic dialects from this period, Mandean, and you'll have a separate lecture on that topic, and also Syriac, and so there's also other, and some Middle Persian as well. There's some bowls in Middle Persian too, but here I'm going to just talk about the Jewish ones. They're written in in Aramaic. They have Hebrew. Often they have Hebrew biblical citations. Others quote from the Aramaic Targum and bring key biblical verses. The bulk of the text, though, is in Aramaic. Now, the value of these texts is phenomenal because they provide us with the state of the language without redaction, without correction. Each text was written by one person and buried, and so therefore it reflects, as best as one could hope, how the language was pronounced and spelt in this time period. And so they are quite remarkable in this way. Now, they reflect the unique vocabulary of magic, not always known from other sources. An example of this, the word for demon. The word for demon found in almost every single bowl is the word deva, which is a loan word from Middle Persian dev. Now, although this is so common a word, it's not found even once in the whole of the Babylonian Talmud, for which they have another word for demon, the word sheda. And so we see that certain different sources had different vocabularies, chose different language for themselves. So a few thousand bowls have been found, and most have not quite been studied closely yet and published. And so it's a source for new research of the dialect, and it's also a source for new vocabulary, which is being discovered with each new bowl. If we take a look at an example of one and two bowls, we can see get a sense of what we're finding in these bowls. So here is a bowl for success in business for a shop. We can see what the shop is selling. May you seek and bring to my door and to my entrance and to my gate. I, who are Tan, the son of Miri, I, the businessman and the seller and the purchaser, upon the good smell and upon good fragrances, like swift ravens and like torches of fire, and like birds and fowls that depart and come from the place of the house of their nests, and from place to place, and from city to place. Thus may people depart and come swiftly to my door, and to my entrance and to my gate. I, Watan, the son of Mirai, the businessman and the purchaser, indeed, for all my business and for all my buying and my selling, in the name of El Shaddai, the Lord of hosts, Amen, Amen, Selah. And then he quotes a verse in Hebrew from the Bible. Until now, it was all Aramaic. It was all original Aramaic that's not been found anywhere else, only here in this beautiful text. So here, that's one example of what we have here. Another bowl, here one can see the text is far simpler. We can take a look at a small part of this text. After quoting a verse from the book of Isaiah in Hebrew, it continues, shifts to the blessing, may it annul from Meshashia, the son of Imi, the Ebu, all evil charms and all evil demons and all evil images and all evil thoughts and all harm demons and all apoplexy demons and all male idle spirits and all female spirits and all curses and all afflictions and all vows and all dispatches of sorcery and all oaths, etc. He wants to cover all ground here. What is interesting here is the name of the client. The name of the client, Meshashia, the son of Imed Ebu. Meshashia is a known name. It's found also in the Babylonian Talmud. The mother's name, Imed Ebu, the mother of his father. But it's the way it was pronounced. It's spelt the way it was pronounced, and an interesting indication of what we have here. So what we've seen is a series of dialects in Babylonian Jewish Aramaic, separated by time from the earlier ones to the later ones, separated also by geography from the ones that were from the languages that were used in the land of Israel, the languages that were used in Babylonia. What is quite striking here is the richness and the diversity. Often a rabbinic text will, on the same page, include text in the vernacular Aramaic, alongside it biblical Aramaic from a citation, perhaps a source quoted in its original Palestinian Aramaic, and Middle Aramaic forms such as the legal texts. This could all be placed together sometimes in a page, and the literature knows how to distinguish between the different dialects. It keeps the separation between them well. And this dialect of late Aramaic had a long life as a living language, and even in the 11th century in Baghdad, one of the leaders of the Jewish academy there could call the Aramaic that they spoke our language. Okay, thank you. Look forward to questions if you have any.
Merci beaucoup, Geoffrey, pour cette présentation de différents dialectes de différentes régions et de différentes périodes. Il présente une carte à la fois riche et variée, et on l'a vu, des supports et des types de textes aussi variés, depuis les inscriptions jusqu'au texte littéraire. Et donc, merci pour cette présentation très riche. Certains dans la salle auront peut-être des questions, bien à distance.